Well, hello there, Space Monkeys. Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden, and in this episode, we're going to be reading Chapter 5 of Blackshirts and Reds out loud. This is by Michael Parenti, and this chapter is called Stalin's Fingers. The first part is going to be talking about how the deaths under Stalin, the approximations that you hear, the numbers getting thrown around in the US and in the West, are greatly exaggerated. The second part, we're going to be talking about the gulags, and again, how the Russian prisons were not as bad as they get a reputation as being now. That doesn't mean they weren't bad, but we're going to talk about the details on the gulag. And then the last part of the chapter, and we'll do the full chapter today, it's relatively short, is the most important part of the chapter, where it talks about what socialism has actually done despite being blocked at every corner by capitalism over the last 100 years in Stalin's Russia and China since 1949. There are a lot of great things that have come out of these societies. They're going to talk about a lot of the accomplishments that communism and socialism has had over the last century, which is really the most important part of the chapter. It's really interesting. So we're going to start on page 76, Stalin's Fingers. In 1989 to 1991, remarkable transformations swept across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Communist governments were overthrown. Large portions of their publicly owned economies were dismantled and handed over to private owners at garage sale prices. And one-party rule was replaced with multi-party parliamentary systems. For Western leaders who had tirelessly pursued the rollback of communism, it was a dream come true. If the overthrow of communism was a victory for democracy, as some claimed, it was even more a victory for free market capitalism and conservative anti-communism. Some of the credit should go to the CIA and other Cold War agencies, along with the National Endowment for Democracy. Where do I know that name from? Bellingcat. Got their hands in all of our propaganda. The AFL-CIO, which is the Congress of Industrial Organizations, big union, bunch of unions. The Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Pew Charitable Trusts, and various right-wing groups, all of whom funded free market, anti-communist political organizations and publications throughout Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, in what swiftly became best-financed chain of revolutions in the history of mankind. The upheavals occurred with remarkably little violence. As Lech Walesa boasted in November 1989, Polish solidarity overthrew the communist government without breaking a single window. This says at least as much about the government that was overthrown as about the rebels. Rather than acting as the U.S.-supported rulers in El Salvador, Colombia, Zaire, Indonesia, with death squad terrorism and mass repression, the communists relinquished power almost without firing a shot. The relatively peaceful transition does not fit our image of unscrupulous totalitarians who stop at nothing to maintain power over captive populations. Why didn't the ruthless Reds act more ruthlessly? How many victims? We have heard much about the ruthless Reds, beginning with the reign of terror and repression perpetrated during the dictatorship of Joseph Stalin from 1929 to 1953. Estimates of those who perished under Stalin's rule, based principally on speculations by writers who never reveal how they arrive at such figures, vary wildly. Thus, Roy Medvedev put Stalin's victims from 5 to 7 million. Robert Conquest decided on 7 to 8 million. Olga Shatunovskaya claims 19.8 million just for the 1935 to 1940 period. Stephen Cohen says 9 million by 1939, with 3 million executed or dying from mistreatment during the 1936 to 39 period. And Arthur Koestler tells us it was 20 to 25 million. More recently, William Rusher of the Claremont Institute refers to the, quote, 100 million people wantonly murdered by communist dictators since the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. That was in the Oakland Tribune in 96. And Richard Lowry blames the Stalin era for, quote, the slaughter of millions. That was from the New York Times in 1996. Unburdened by any documentation, these estimates invite us to conclude that the sum total of people incarcerated in the labor camps over a 22-year period, allowing for turnovers due to death and term expirations, would have constituted an astonishing portion of the Soviet population. The support and supervision of the Gulag and all labor camps, labor colonies, and prisons of the Soviet system would have been the USSR's single largest enterprise. Sort of like the military-industrial complex, or the prison-industrial complex in the United States. The Gulag never had the percentage of population incarcerated that America now has. America has like almost 2.5 million people, I believe, maybe even more than that. It's an enormous amount of our population, like almost 1% or something like that is incarcerated in the United States in some form. In the absence of reliable evidence, we are fed anecdotes, such as the story Winston Churchill tells of the time he asked Stalin how many people died in the famine. According to Churchill, the Soviet leader responded by raising both his hands, a gesture that may have signified an unwillingness to broach the subject. But since Stalin happened to have 5 fingers on each hand, Churchill concluded, without benefit of clarifying follow-up questions, that Stalin was confessing to 10 million victims. Would the head of one state, especially the secretive Stalin, casually proffer such an admission to the head of another? To this day, Western writers treat this woolly tale as an ironclad confession of mass atrocities. What we do know of Stalin's purges is that many victims were Communist Party officials, managers, military officers, and other strategically situated individuals whom the dictator saw fit to incarcerate or liquidate. In addition, whole categories of people whom Stalin considered of unreliable loyalty, Cossacks, Crimean Tatars, and ethnic Germans, were selected for internal deportation. Though they never saw the inside of a prison or a labor camp, they were subjected to non-custodial resettlement in Central Asia and Siberia. To be sure, crimes of state were committed in communist countries, and many political prisoners were unjustly interned and even murdered. But the inflated numbers offered by Cold War scholars serve neither historical truth nor the cause of justice, but merely help to reinforce a knee-jerk fear and loathing of those terrible Reds. In 1993, for the first time, several historians gained access to previously secret Soviet police archives and were able to establish well-documented estimates of prison and labor camp populations. They found that the total population of the entire Gulag as of January 1939, near the end of the Great Purges, was about 2,022,976, so just over 2 million. At about that time, there began a purge of the purgers, including many intelligence and secret police, the NKVD, officials and members of the judiciary and other investigative committees who were suddenly held responsible for the excesses of the terror despite their protestations of fidelity to the regime. Soviet labor camps were not death camps like those the Nazis built across Europe. There was no systematic extermination of inmates, no gas chambers or crematoria to dispose of millions of bodies. Despite harsh conditions, the great majority of Gulag inmates survived and eventually returned to society when granted amnesty or when their terms were finished. In any given year, 20 to 40% of the inmates were released, according to the archive records. Oblivious to these facts, the Moscow correspondent of the New York Times in '96 continues to describe the Gulag as, quote, the largest system of death camps in modern history. Almost 1 million Gulag prisoners were released during the World War II to serve in the military. The archives reveal that more than half of all Gulag deaths for the 1934 to 53 period occurred during the war years, from 41 to 45. Mostly from malnutrition, when severe privation was the common lot of the entire Soviet population. Some 22 million Soviet citizens perished in the war. In 1944, for instance, the labor camp death rate was 92 per 1,000. By 1953, with the post-war recovery, camp deaths had declined to 3 per 1,000. Should all Gulag inmates be considered innocent victims of Red repression? Contrary to what we have been led to believe, those arrested for political crimes, quote-unquote, counter-revolutionary offenses, numbered from 12 to 33% of the prison population, varying from year to year. The vast majority of inmates were charged with non-political offenses such as murder, assault, theft, banditry, smuggling, swindling, and other violations punishable in any society. Total executions from 1921 to 1953, a 33-year span, were about 799,455. No breakdown of this figure was provided by the researchers. It includes those who were guilty of non-political capital crimes, as well as those who collaborated in the Western capitalist invasion and subsequent White Guard Army atrocities. It also includes some of the considerable numbers who collaborated with the Nazis during World War II, and probably German SS prisoners. In any case, the killings of political opponents were not in the millions or tens of millions, which is not to say that the actual number was either inconsequential or justifiable. The three historians who studied the heretofore secret Gulag records concluded that the number of victims were far less than they usually claimed in the West. This finding is ridiculed by anti-communist liberal Adam Hochschild, who prefers to repeat Churchill's story about Stalin's fingers. That's from the New York Times in '96. Like many others, Hochschild has no trouble accepting undocumented speculations about the Gulag, but much difficulty accepting the documented figures drawn from NKVD archives. Where did the Gulag go? Some Russian anti-communist writers, such as Solzhenitsyn and Sarkov, and many U.S. anti-communist liberals, maintain that the Gulag existed right down to the last days of communism. If so, where did it disappear to? After Stalin's death in 1953, more than half of the Gulag inmates were freed, according to the study of NKVD files previously cited. But if so many others remained incarcerated, why have they not materialized? When the communist states were overthrown, where were the half-starved hordes pouring out of internment camps with their tales of travail? One of the last remaining Soviet labor camps, Perm 35, was visited in 1989 by Republican congressmen and again in 1990 by French journalists and National Geographic. Both parties found only a few dozen prisoners, some of whom were identified as outright spies. Others were refuseniks, who had been denied the right to emigrate. Prisoners worked 8 hours a day, 6 days a week for 250 rubles, about $40 a month. One of the supposedly vast numbers of political prisoners said to exist in the other quote-unquote communist totalitarian police states of Eastern Europe. Why no evidence of their mass release in the post-communist era? And where are the mass of political prisoners in Cuba? Asked about this, Professor Alberto Prieto of the University of Havana pointed out that even a recent State Department report on human rights showed hundreds of people being tortured, killed, or disappeared in almost all the Latin American countries, but mentions only 6 alleged political prisoners in reference to Cuba, according to People's Weekly World in '94. If there were mass atrocities right down to the last days of communism, why did not the newly installed anti-communist regimes seize the opportunity to bring erstwhile communist rulers to justice? Why no Nuremberg-style public trials documenting widespread atrocities? Why were not hundreds of party leaders and security officials and thousands of camp guards rounded up and tried for the millions they supposedly exterminated? The best the West Germans could do was charge East German leader Erich Honecker, several other officials, and 7 border guards with shooting people who tried to escape over the Berlin Wall. A serious charge, but hardly indicative of a gulag. Authorities in Western Capitalist Federal Republic of Germany did contrive a charge of treason against persons who served as officials, military officers, soldiers, judges, attorneys, and others of the now defunct German Democratic Republic, a sovereign nation that once had full standing in the United Nations, and most of whose citizens had never been subjects of the FRG. As of '96, more than 300 treason cases have been brought to trial, including the former GDR, that's German Democratic Republic, intelligence chief, a defense minister, and 6 generals, all indicted for carrying out what were their legal duties under the construction and laws of the GDR, in some instances fighting fascism and CIA sabotage. Many of the defendants were eventually acquitted, but a number were sentenced to prison. What we witness here is the Nuremberg trials in reverse. Reds put on trial for their anti-fascist efforts by West German, friendly to fascism prosecutors using a retroactive application of FRG penal law for GDR citizens. As of the beginning of '97, several thousand more trials were expected. In 1995, Miroslav Stefan, the former secretary of the Prague Communist Party was sentenced to 2.5 years for ordering Czech police to use tear gas and water cannons against demonstrators in 1988. This is the best example of bloodthirsty red oppression that the capitalist restorationists in Czechoslovakia could find. An action that does not even qualify as a crime in most Western nations. No shit, that's every day in the United States, basically. Our activists and protesters get treated way worse than that by police, pretty routinely. In 1996 in Poland, 12 elderly Stalin-era political policemen were sentenced to prison for having beaten and mistreated prisoners over 50 years earlier during the communist takeover after World War II. Again, one might wonder why post-communist leaders seeking to bring the communist tyrants to justice could find nothing more serious to prosecute than a police assault case from a half-century before. Most of those incarcerated in the Gulag were not political prisoners, and the same appears to be true of inmates in the other communist states. In 1989, when the millionaire playwright Václav Havel became president of Czechoslovakia, he granted amnesty to about 2/3 of the country's prison population, which numbered not in the millions, but in the thousands. Havel assumed that most of those incarcerated under communism were victims of political repression and therefore deserved release. He and his associates were dismayed to discover that a good number were experienced criminals who lost no time in resuming their unsavory pursuits, according to the New York Times in 1991. Now, this is the most important part of the chapter here, guys, this last 3 pages. Memories of Maldevelopment. In Chapter 2, I discussed the role of popular revolution in advancing the condition of humankind. That analysis would apply as well to communist revolutions and is worth reiterating in the present context. We hear a great deal about the crimes of communism, but almost nothing about its achievements. The communist governments inherited societies burdened with age-old legacy of economic exploitation and maldevelopment. Much of pre-communist Eastern Europe, as with pre-revolutionary Russia and China, was in effect a third-world region with widespread poverty and almost non-existent capital formation. Most rural transportation was still by horse and wagon. The devastation of World War II added another heavy layer of misery upon the region, reducing hundreds of villages and many cities to rubble. It was the communists and their allies who rebuilt these societies. While denounced in the U.S. press for leaving their enemies in bad shape, in fact, the Reds left the economy of Eastern Europe in far better condition than they found it. The same was true of China. Henry Rosemont Jr. notes that when the communists liberated Shanghai from the U.S.-supported reactionary Kuomintang regime in 1949, about 20% of that city's population, an estimated 1.2 million people, were drug addicts. Every morning there were special street crews whose, quote, sole task was to gather up the corpses of the children, adults, and the elderly who had been murdered during the night or had been abandoned and died of disease, cold, or starvation. During the years of Stalin's reign, the Soviet nation made dramatic gains in literacy, industrial wages, healthcare, and women's rights. These accomplishments usually go unmentioned when the Stalinist era is discussed. To say that quote-unquote socialism doesn't work is to overlook the fact that it did. In Eastern Europe, Russia, China, Mongolia, North Korea, and Cuba, revolutionary communism created a life for the mass of people that was far better than the wretched existence they had endured under feudal lords, military bosses, foreign colonizers, and Western capitalists. The end result was a dramatic improvement in living conditions for hundreds of millions of people on a scale never before or since witnessed in history. And if I may, China just eliminated extreme poverty. They've eliminated homelessness a long time ago. They don't even have extreme poverty anymore. As of last year, they were triumphantly reporting that is true. They might have, impoverished areas, but extreme poverty is gone in China as of last year. State socialism transformed desperately poor countries into modernized societies in which everyone had enough food, clothing, and shelter, where elderly people had secure pensions, and where all children and many adults went to school and no one was denied medical attention. Some of us from poor families who carry around the hidden injuries of class are much impressed by these achievements and are unwilling to dismiss them as merely, quote-unquote, economistic. But what of the democratic rights that these people were denied? In fact, with the exception of Czechoslovakia, these countries had known little political democracy in the days before communism. Russia was a czarist autocracy, Poland a rightist dictatorship with concentration camps of its own, Albania an Italian fascist protectorate as early as 1927, Cuba a US-sponsored dictatorship. Lithuania, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria were outright fascist regimes allied with Nazi Germany in World War II. Then there were the distorting effects that unremitting capitalism encirclement had upon the building of socialism. Throughout its entire 73-year history of counter-revolutionary invasion, civil war, forced industrialization, Stalinist purges and deportations, Nazi conquest, Cold War, and nuclear arms race, the Soviet Union did not know one day of peaceful development. In the attempt to maintain military parity with the US, the Soviets took on crushing defense costs that seriously depleted their civilian economy. In addition, they faced monetary boycott, trade discrimination, and technological embargo from the West. So things have not changed, is what you're telling me. We're doing that now. The people who lived under communism endured chronic shortages, long lines, poor quality goods and services, and many other problems. They wanted a better life, and who could blame them? Without capitalist encirclement, they would have had a better chance of solving more of their internal problems. All this is not to deny the very real deficiencies of the communist systems. Here I want to point out that much of the credit for the deformation and the overthrow of communism should go to the Western forces that tirelessly dedicated themselves to that task, using every possible means of political, economic, military, and diplomatic aggression to achieve a success that will continue to cost the people of the world dearly. So that's Chapter 5. Chapter 6 is called The Free Market Paradise Goes East, Part 1. That's on page 87. We'll be starting that probably sometime next week. I got to work the next couple of days. Hope you're enjoying this, guys. And this is, again, Black Shirts and Reds by Michael Parenti. It is a fantastic book so far.